You often see a lot of questions online with regard to design of permaculture plant guilds. A plant guild being an assemblage of plants, typically of different heights, that cooperate with each other to create a nice block of almost like a mini food forest system. So you'll have like an overstory tree, maybe an understory tree, a couple of shrubs, maybe 4 or 5 shrubs, and then some ground cover. So a nice guild, and which of those plants work well together, that are productive and, you know, aesthetically pleasing, but also ones that aren't going to outcompete each other and, you know, cooperate and work nicely together. There's a couple of approaches to that. One way is to ask local people that are doing similar work to the sort of thing that you're proposing on the landscape. Another way is to look at climate analogues from further away. So, you know, like the boreal forest is largely the same right across the far north, regardless of whether you're in, you know, North America or Northern Europe. You know, that forest is broadly similar in terms of ecosystem and, you know, how it behaves. But if you're moving into an area that there isn't a great deal, so I mean, this is the far north of Scotland. There are quite a few permaculturists, some people doing, you know, similar things, you know, in the far north. Absolutely, we know quite a few of them. But beyond things like just simple, you know, garden planning, you know, what works well with apple trees, what works well with plum trees, and it's still broadly the same as the rest of the UK. You know, there's a huge amount of overlap there, except that, you know, some things won't do so well here just because of, you know, the wind conditions, or it's too watery or whatever, you know, depending on, you know, the very localized environment beyond just, you know, how far north we are. But beyond that, if you're looking beyond the garden into shelter belts and things, it's always interesting to see, okay, in terms of yield from shelter belt, how can we maximize that? And the way to increase that is to find which plants work well together, which trees cooperate nicely, which are usually which do you see in natural plant assemblies out in the woods. Now, this far north, there isn't, I think we've got to go 100 miles to come to anything like ancient forest. I go there regularly. It's a beautiful place. I spend a lot of time there just, you know, recharging and also, you know, studying. But this far north, there's not so much by way of ancient woodland, but there are regenerating woodlands, and also ones that are regenerating over from what has previously been a timber crop plantation, such as this place behind us. Now, this place here, they're actually sitting on the outer main wall of a Iron Age broch, which is a whole other thing. I'm not going to do a video on brochs. Have a Google, it's really interesting, unique to the north of Scotland. There are lessons to be learnt from the broch builders as to where they built and how and why, as well as, you know, further beyond up into Orkney and so on, some of the structures that have been discovered there, absolutely. But that's about, you know, well, good design housing. It's a whole other subject. But this forest behind me and this area has been occupied for thousands of years, of course. But it won't have looked anything like that. The tree assemblies that were available to them are very different from those now, but then of course it's a very different landscape that we have here now in terms of temperature, apart from anything else. Also, it's much wetter. You know, it's gone through a lot of changes, both, you know, both directions in terms of wetness. You know, it's gone through dry and wet periods, and the landscape has changed dramatically as a result throughout that. So this was last harvested in 2008, I think. So, you know, within the last couple of decades. Some of the pine trees clearly predate that, so they weren't harvested, but most of the growth since then is just naturally regenerated since then. And there has also been a certain amount of deliberate planting. Some of the trees in this block, for example, have got the remnants of the plastic guards around them to, you know, clear them above, you know, vole and deer pressure until they're big enough to support themselves. So it's a very interesting landscape in that it's relatively recent. These tree assemblies have occurred, and, you know, those that have, you know, are thriving now have done so under a, you know, very similar environment to what we're planting into now. It's about 50-60 miles from where we live, maybe 40 miles south as the crow flies, so it's very relevant. There's a few others that are nearby. We might show walks around that at some point, but this is the one we come through today. So this is basically us walking through the woodland, pointing out this is how we select for trees that cooperate together, ones that naturally do well together here, because if we can replicate that in planned design systems, we know they're going to behave like natural ecosystems. We know they're not going to need a huge amount of input. We know they're not going to need a huge amount of maintenance, which is exactly what we want. We want to have a productive system that doesn't require a huge amount of work and inputs, or no inputs at all, ideally. Now, in terms of plant assemblies, this is just something we're using for inspiration. We don't necessarily look at the exact, varieties that are growing here naturally and decide we'll just put those together. So if, for example, there's not much wild cherry here, but there are a few trees. But in other places I've come across this, you'll find a wild cherry growing alongside, broom as an understory, which I'm surrounded by it. But then you've got, brambles and raspberry and ground covers and so on. Yeah, that's all very interesting, but it doesn't mean we go and stick a wild cherry in. What we do is we put a named cultivar cherry tree. Below that we go for, if we've got, say, for example, a wild strawberry covering the ground, we'll plant instead with a really high yielding strawberry instead. It's just to give us a nudge in the right direction. We don't go for the strict varieties. Sometimes it's even just the family. So, for example, a lot of thistles grow in the highlands. For areas that are protected enough, they can do globe artichoke, which is a member of the thistle family, and it should do well. It's a good indicator that that plant should grow well there. It's too cold where we are. We did have a load of them. They all died. Now we're going with cardoon, and they seem to be doing better. Over time, as the land begins become more sheltered and slightly warmer, we'll perhaps try them again in the future. But for the moment, that's what we've got. But again, we were led in that direction by the fact that thistles grow well here. So you don't have to be limited to the exact same plant, but use it as a suggestion in terms of that's in the same family as whatever, so we can grow that instead. So, we're going to take a walk around the woods. We're just filming quick before anyone else turns up because we're right in the car park. I don't really like filming when there's other people around, it's not fair to them. But we're literally right here in the car park, and we've got the crow. We've got a pine tree overstory. In terms of pines, there are a lot of pines that are really useful. You've got, stone pine, you've got the Korean pine, really good pine nut producing varieties that most of the ones that you buy in the supermarkets in terms of pine nuts are from those species. Korean pine in particular, apparently. But even under that, we've got bramble. So if you've got as a suitable understory for that, we know that bramble does really well. It's not massively high producing, of course, because it's still an understory, but it is productive. So in a plant system, of course, you could swap that out with a nice high yielding thornless variety. You could grow it in a good strip up to some sort of simple trellis or whatever. It doesn't have to be sprawling all over the place like this, but we know that it will function in terms of it'll do well under pine trees. I've seen it 1,000 times. I've also seen, not here, but I've seen in other places, a different variety of pine along, like this, right along the edge of an actual hard standing, where they've actually come up into the lower branches and then arced over and down, and the fruit is hanging naturally at chest to head height. It's an amazing system, and it's something we're going to replicate extensively when we've got a bit more maturity. But again, this just reinforces that pine, bramble work. We've also got, obviously, a lot of heather, which, is right through this whole area. Heather, of course, is a good pollinator attractant. It can be used for beer. It can be used for distilling into perfumes and so on. Really useful plant. Again, it's not absolutely covered with flowers, but there's still a decent amount coming out. We've also got some ferns growing, and this is all here in the car park, bear in mind. Well, ferns aren't very useful, but there are edible varieties of ferns. The one that grows in this country, or can grow in this country, would be the ostrich fern. And if you're creating a plant system, as a guild underneath a pine, it's an interesting thing that you could, use just by design. You probably wouldn't want half an acre of it. They're quite expensive to buy. But if you're propagating your own over time, of course, that's simpler. So all this is right here in the car park. The other side of this little track, we've got a little bit of gorse still existing along the side, and that's probably a little bit of a relic from when this was last harvested. That was in 2008, I think. So all this has been, either regenerated or regrown since. These look planted. It doesn't look like a natural regeneration in this area. Elsewhere it does, but this looks more like a planted. So it's possible, of course, that these weren't harvested at that time, and these are ones that they left to protect the car park. I didn't really start coming here until a decade later, so I don't know that history of this woodland that well. But it's interesting to study partially because of that. We've got a lot of birch coming through with the canopies a bit looser. That's coming through as an understory, so you can see a bit of succession going on. Birch, very useful, really good firewood, good firelighter, a very good pioneer species, and of course you've got an edible sap in the spring that you can take from it. That's a bit of fun. We used to do that a lot. Right next to it, again, right here in the car park, we got a pond. This is not a naturally occurring pond. This has been dug. Right, there's a car just pulled up, so we'll move quickly. So there's also a load of fungi. Below the ground, there's a load of boletes, which do really well in pine forests. In terms of pond systems, this is interesting because, in fact, let's go a bit further around, a bit more privacy. Okay. So a couple of things here. First off, the most obvious is the greater reed mace, the Typha latifolia. You can see it's, sometimes people call it bulrush. It's not, it's a different species from that. It's an amazing plant. We use it extensively. I'm going to continue to use it because I want to plant up systems using it as animal fodder, and that's going to be one of our prime ones. There's also some frogbit in here, which is a really nice, like a mini lily pad, really pretty plant. But beneath that, you can see it's starting to take over the entire understory here. That is Crassula helmsii. That is one of the most aggressively invasive plants in the UK. It's a massive problem anywhere it occurs. And unfortunately, we have it in all of our pond systems on the Croft. It's a huge problem. So it's a major problem. I'm not sure what the management strategy for it is here. I've got a few things I'm going to be trying on the Croft because you can't eradicate it. It is just the new reality, and it's a major problem. You can see just how much it's taking over. It grows below the water at the surface level and above the water, and changes form depending on which environment it's in. So it's virtually impossible to eradicate. I mean, genuinely, you know, fire, poison, doesn't matter. You know, this stuff's unkillable. It's a major, major problem. I was quite unhappy about it for some time. We've got a management plan in place now. It just takes time and a little bit of money, so I'm being philosophical about it. But, you know, this is the reality of it. You know, it is something that we're having to deal with, and they are here as well. So, back onto the more positive stuff. You can see alder. Now, this is probably common alder, and you can see it's a real pioneer for next up aquatic systems. Alder loves water. It's a really interesting plant. It's the only deciduous conifer. It coppices really well, so it's a really good form of stick fuel. And also, it's a nitrogen fixer. So again, it's a pioneer, improves the land around it. The leaf fall is loaded with nitrogen. We're using this really very extensively in the shelter belts. But here, more specifically, we're saying, okay, what grows well with alder? Well, we can see alder does very well next to water systems in which Typha latifolia is growing. And that's a key one for us. It's brilliant. Also, willow. There's that type of willow, and there's another type of willow here, which seem they're very closely related. If they're not, you know, they could easily be cuttings of each other. So this again will coppice very readily. We're using a lot of willow, so we can go with a really high yielding biomass willow, and we know that'll grow quite happily without being in direct competition with Typha latifolia in an aquatic system. Well, that's a particular combination that we're going to be using. And seeing this here, it reinforces, yes, that'll work. They're not going to end up, you know, in competition and wiping each other out. There's a few other interesting things around. So, for example, what we got, there's more bramble. There's also rosebay willow herb. There's quite a bit of that coming through. Again, that's an edible plant. It's not something you use a huge amount of. It's more of an interesting thing. But, you know, we have eaten it. It is an interesting plant.
In Eastern Europe, they ferment it.
They do. They make an alcoholic drink by stripping the pith out of it in huge volume, which sort of comes on like very loose strands, and they tie them into bundles, they dry them, and then in the winter they use the rich sugar source from that to brew into various drinks. It's really cool. It's a very useful plant. It's just that it's not something we use particularly. So literally just 10 feet further on, so we've got the willow, we've got the alder, we've got the water system, we've also got mare's tail starting to come through, and there's a lot more of it as an understory. I mean, really in quite dark spaces. This is useful. People use it as a pot scrubber in some part of the world because it holds up really well to abrasion because it's got silica in it. But I tend to use this on the Croft. I'll cut it in large volume, I'll dry it down, then I'll add that to the worm bin so that then the worm castings coming through have got a lot of silica in them. So you use it, things like that, things that accumulate a certain mineral in their leaves. We can use that then to amend something like a compost or a worm casting for specific needs that we've got. So really good strong cell walls in plants that we're growing in pots and greenhouses and so on. Really good, really good strong silica content, and that's the easiest way of harvesting it on a small scale. And we're lucky that we got it growing on the Croft. A lot of people hate it, consider it a weed, try to eradicate it. It's part of the ecosystem, we'll use it. If we're not using it for food, we'll use it for something else. Invasives exist. I mean, this stuff, the Crassula helmsii, I don't like it. We're still going to find a use for it. That's a whole other video, but it's just showing that if you've got a problem, it's a very trite thing, the whole thing, the problem is a solution. It's massively overused and it irritates the hell out of me. But sometimes there is a certain amount of truth to it. What can we use that for? What will eat that? And that's kind of the route that we're going to be taking. We've also got thistles growing here. This is Scotland, there's thistles everywhere. But, you know, the very big aggressive thistle that grows in the Highlands, the roots of that are apparently edible. I've not eaten it myself yet. We plan on doing it every year, we never do. But more specifically, what have we got that's a thistle type that'll grow well in this environment? Well, we got globe artichoke a bit further south, or up here cardoon does quite well, which is something that we're using. So instead of thinking of what specific plant will grow well here, what type of plant will grow here, so we know we can go with all sorts of high biomass willows, because willows are going to love this environment and won't compete with the stuff we want to grow. But the same goes for the thistle family. So again, we go with what's a high yielding version of that. Here we have raspberries growing. Again, these are just wild raspberries. They're not particularly high yielding, and they are in the shade. You know, they're right next to willow saplings. So we could plant a good stand of ones in a similar environment with the same type of overstory with a high yielding cultivar of a particular raspberry, and that gives us another one. So it's all about just seeing what's here naturally, what can we tweak, what can we work with, what plant families are here that are working and growing happily in combination, and how can we combine them in our own systems to have it function like this. Because don't forget, none of this has got any input. It's been slashed back periodically. That's about it. It's never been fed. It's never been fertilized. It's never had herbicides spread around it. It's never had fungicides. It's had none of that. It just here does its thing, growing every year, generating biomass, producing a huge amount of food for wildlife, and just doing its thing. If we were to tickle this just slightly with a little bit of care, a little bit of chop and drop and going for the better varieties, we could tweak this into a far more productive system that behaves very much like this. So it's an interesting starting point. Right, let's walk a bit further in. One other big thing, so I just came back to film. There's a little rocky island out in the middle of the pond, just towards the back end of it, and there's a little tiny tuft of grass, and on that there's a little tiny duck. That's, I don't know if she's made a permanent island out there, permanent nest out there, but, oh, what was that? That's another duck.
Might be her.
So,
Might be her mate.
it's both female from the looks of it.
Oh, yeah.
So you can see, the other thing with the pond, of course, is ducks. So we could just use it for, in terms of wildlife. There's obviously a pair of, probably mallard hybrids is what you tend to get in the wild here, is, something crossed with a mallard. But also, a pond like this, also good for waterfowl, that exists in conjunction with everything else here. You could easily implement something like, a little flock of muscovy ducks, or whatever works in your environment. So just on a little bit further, and we start getting rowan. Mountain ash is into the frame. This has got a usable berry. It's not the best, but there are other varieties within this family that are good. So the checkers, the wild service tree, very closely related to it. So purely in terms of food forestry, we've got alder as a nitrogen fixer next to rowan. You can see they're both doing very nicely as an understory underneath an even bigger alder. Underneath that we got fern and we got bramble. So we know all those things could be swapped out with productive varieties, albeit the alder tree would be something that would be coppiced or pollarded for fuel. But again, massively useful, and everything's doing its own thing really happily, input free, just doing it year after year. You can see the lichen growth here, and there's various parts of this woodland have got significant lichen growth, and it doesn't take as long to grow as you think. Now this, of course, a lot of lichens have use in dyeing, but also another possibility with it, certain types, is if you take something like this clump here, let's just pull that off. If I take that and I dye that, or I spray that a different colour, it's used by model makers for making bushes and things. There's niche yields in all sorts of stuff. In this case, lichen, and that's a completely regenerative resource that'll just keep regrowing. Some of these trees you can barely see the bark on them because there's so much lichen grown on them. There's tons of the stuff. So again, you wouldn't go out into the woods and just denude the forest of this stuff. But if it's your own, you take a few bags a year and you sell that for significant money. That's entirely regenerative. So You probably wouldn't set out to farm something like this intentionally, you know, from, okay, I'm going to plant a load of trees and I'm going to cover them in lichen and so on. But if you've got something that you find that as the system matures, lichen tend to grow on, or you've got a dark corner somewhere that the lichen like to grow, you know, it's useful. The right lichen has a lot of utility value in terms of, as I say, dying and so on. But also, things like, that's just one thing I happen to know. Imagine how many hundreds of others there are in here that I haven't identified. It'd be very arrogant for me to say, I'm coming in here, I'm going to identify all the niche uses of all these trees. No, I'm barely scratching the surface, especially I know more than I'm saying in the video. And there's, for everything I know, there'll be 100 I don't. There'll be so much utility in this woodland. It's incredible. So this nudged in a slightly different direction by design to be more productive, amazing. And it's a nice space to spend time. This is broom. This is a nitrogen fixing legume, and this is a perfect pioneer species. We'll come to that later. You know, this is partly what we're doing here today. But it's interesting that you've got this big overstory of pine trees that have obviously been here for decades, and below that we've got birch and we've got willow and things like that, and just sort of hanging around, waiting for their opportunity. This broom only lists, well, the books will tell you 5 to 7 years. We've had it last a bit longer than that. So I'm going to assume that this one's been here a while. I mean, you can see that's a big bush, but it's certainly no more than 10 years old. It's a nitrogen fixer, so it's a good pioneer species. And all along here, we've got alder. And so we've got more alder. So all nitrogen fixing pioneer species in the subcanopy, and these have almost certainly been grazed and cut repeatedly, but they're waiting for their chance. So as the pine goes, or the pine's harvested, the system's there, ready, waiting to make a surge for the light. And they're the big pioneer species, along with the birch and the willow. So again, for shelter growth, if you want to put a good solid shelter belt in, you could do a lot worse than putting in a load of alder and broom and willow and birch. In this particular environment, you know, this far north in Scotland, that particular combination is going to do very well. And those, in addition with a lot of other stuff as well, for the later succession that have gone in at the same time, is one of the systems that we're working with in our eastern shelter belt. So it's interesting to see the decisions that we've made previously being repeated and verified to a degree by seeing a natural system like this where they're working in conjunction and just ready to throw up a huge amount of biomass, because that's exactly what we need. So at this spot, in addition to, I mean, we're surrounded by rowan, we got birch, we've got alder, still a lot of alder, we've got raspberry, we've got bramble, but I've just started seeing holly. See, it's a significant holly tree. Holly, of course, you need a male and a female to make a berry crop, but of course, around the Christmas time, that's a very saleable crop. You know, if you've got sprigs of holly with berries on, that people haven't had to buy from 1,000 miles away, that's a very saleable crop. It's a very good understory plant. I mean, the top of it has actually got a certain amount of canopy access, but lower down, that's in deep shade, you know. This is getting on for noon, you know, it's a fairly overcast day, but it's not, you know, this is still noon, and you can see it's still relatively dark down in here, but this is still putting on a huge amount of, you know, growth. It's still very green, glossy leaves. We've got, I think, 50, 60 holly that we've planted, and a few males as well, so that we've got the potential to make berries. It's going to take decades, and we probably won't see it in our lifetime, a real good, viable yield from them, but we still planted them. It's...
Someone will.
That's the thing, you know, planting and designing for our own lifetimes is always hugely problematic, you know. We're not living on a planet that only exists for one human lifetime. We need to be thinking glacially, you know. We need to be thinking in terms of aeons, not a few decades, you know. But that's a whole other rant. But yeah, it's interesting because that is another very good, high-yielding crop from low in the food forest canopy that you don't usually think of as being something usable, but also not so much here because it's got a, you know, because of the lay of the land and it's so damp. In other environments you can get very clear land under a holly bush because it creates a fair amount of shade and a certain amount of dry land as well. So when everything else is wet, you can go and sit under a holly tree and you can sit and have a brew, you know. It's a very useful tree. We've used it extensively when camping, for example, you know, just to get out of storms and stuff. We've got very positive associations of both holly and yew. I don't think there's any yew in this forest. There are in other places we go. And that again would do well in a similar kind of niche to create really good deep shade that is relatively waterproof. But yeah, it's an interesting spot. There's not a huge amount of it. So it's not like, I haven't seen much holly in this woodland. So just goes to show, you know, a single tree. And that proves a point. It doesn't need to be an entire ecosystem. Holly is a very useful one. Of course, it gives you a crop deep winter. You know, there's not much else doing on your land, whatever else, you know, whatever scale. There's not much else happening. Holly, it looks nice even in winter, and it gives you a yield at the time of year when not much else does. This is an interesting find. Even here, quite deep in the woodland, you can see there's a nice opening in the canopy now because this huge stand of willow has just gone straight over in a storm. Probably the wind's got too much for the root system and it's gone over. But while it's snapped at the one side here, and in fact this side is still kind of upright because it's been picked up by that tree, this has actually gone over. Now if those trees weren't there and this tree had gone crashing down to the ground, as long as the roots were still attached at this end, kind of, albeit, you know, it's massively split and it's hinged, so, you know, the very edge of it is still connected. There's still the whole unbroken bark for nutrients and water to flow along. But if that was down and it was lying on the ground, which might happen in a subsequent storm, if one of those trees goes down, it might well end up on the ground yet. What this tree will, along its entire length, you can see how it's just pushing shoots out vertically along the entire length of it. You'll be doing that on the ground, but also rooting down into the ground. So if you have a spot that just you can't grow trees in, if you take a great big huge log of willow and you slap that straight onto the ground, you pile up a little bit of earth around it just so that it's well in contact with the ground, that's a really fast and effective way of putting up very quick, very dense hedgerows. I've seen it happen repeatedly in nature, even when it's entirely disconnected from the base. We've actually done this ourselves, and it's a way that we're going to be duplicating larger willow that we're currently trying to produce just to really accelerate the production of you know, biomass willow on swales. It's an interesting thing. So you're not just going for a walk in the woods or going for a walk in whatever ecosystem you live in, looking for inspiration for guilds. You can also find new and interesting ways of solving problems that you haven't even necessarily encountered yet, but just tickles through the back of your head. You know, oh, like that tree's lying down and it's still growing. Wonder why that is. And after it's filtered through and you come across a situation further down the line, it's like, you know what, fix this is that thing I saw 3 or 4 years ago. There's no such thing as, you know, a waste of knowledge. It's interesting, and of course you're seeing succession in actual happening. So you can see there's not a huge amount of bramble around here, but where this opening is cleared up, you can see this bramble just starting to come through as a pioneer species. They'll probably within a few years trees will start to come through, but really what's more likely to happen here is the willow itself will go racing up for it because it's got all the reserves in the trunk and it'll fill the canopy in itself, and this will then become a large stand of willow. It's interesting, and of course as long as we keep coming here we get to see it all happening. So of course we talked about the big perennial woody overstory crops, and we talked about the shrubby underlayer, and we've even talked about ground cover to a degree, but we even talked about the duck, that, you know, the animal kingdom. What we haven't talked about is the third kingdom though, and of course that is fungi. Now you need to introduce fungi into any sort of system that has trees because they form a symbiotic relationship and it'll be much happier. But of course, also individual species of fungi form beneficial symbiotic relationship with particular trees. And those are quite often really useful to us. There's a lot of good medicinal fungi that you can harvest very easily from rotting logs once you know what you're doing with it. But in terms of edible fungi, in terms of putting food on your plate, you don't get much better than this. This is a bolete. It is, I can't even at this point absolutely identify this, and still I can say this is entirely safe to eat because of the location it's growing in. I know that it isn't one of the few inedible, not poisonous, inedible bolete mushrooms that grow in the UK. Because of its location, it's probably a birch bolete, but it could also possibly be a beech bolete. There's a couple of other options, one of which is a bay bolete, which brings me to another subject. I can't eat them. Normally a couple of years ago, I would have taken this home and I would have very least dried it down into a powder or some sort of stock. but incredibly rare. Once in a while someone will develop an intolerance or sensitivity to bay leaves, and that's what happened to me. So we had mushrooms one day, everyone else was fine, and I had a dramatic poisoning response. And you know when you're so ill that if someone gave you a button that you press just to end it all, you would? It was unpleasant, and I never want to be that way again. No, I didn't, but I wanted to. So I will never do that again. As I say, I'd serve this to my children with absolute happiness and certainty. If you're going to learn any family of edible fungi, go for the Beech family. They're very easy to diagnose. They're amazing. Absolutely beautiful. Yeah, very simple to recognise. And they're beautiful. They're really nice mushrooms. And it changes the way you walk through the woods because there's so many of them that you start to learn them, you start forming a relationship with them, and they're beautiful, beautiful mushrooms. And I will absolutely continue to introduce them by taking caps and introducing them into our systems. I'll continue to introduce them to site so that they are there so that other people can eat them as well as the trees benefiting from them. But I will never ever eat a bleak mushroom again, which is a great shame because they're so tasty. But no, not for me. So for the last 3 or 4 minutes of walking, we started seeing little tiny beech trees. And then we were thinking, where's the parent tree? We haven't seen a parent tree. And then we've hit them. So you can see this is a colossal beech. There's also another really huge beech tree off to my left there behind me. It's massive. Beech is really interesting, makes excellent wood. You can do a lot of things with them, including harvest mushrooms. It's an incredible wood, but what you can't do is actually put it anywhere near any buildings or any sort of infrastructure. Beech will suddenly and without warning drop massive branches, like kill you kind of branches. Yeah, you've got to be very careful. You can't camp under beech, for example. So it's just something to be aware of. You need to be cautious. You wouldn't want it over your car park, but it is a beautiful tree. And one of the features of it is it tends to create quite open ground underneath it because the leaves drop so high in a tannin content that not much can degrade them, including most insects, and fungi struggles with it even. So it's an easy way of creating an open space is if you gather a load of beech leaves together and just keep spreading them. You do that for a few years and you're actually starting to create an open space under a tree that isn't necessarily beech. And it's something you can do just a few wheelbarrow loads a year to create a small space like around a bench or whatever to keep it free of things. So it's just a useful technique and a useful feature of learn from something, but also learn its limitations so you can take that resource and use it elsewhere. But beech, of course, is also useful because it does have an edible nut, but it tends to only mast in very infrequently, produce large crops of nuts very infrequently with a few nuts most years, which is really useful in terms of, panage for certain animals like pigs or, goats or whatever. But it's not massively useful in terms of producing a usable nut year in, year out. But it's still a useful tree nevertheless. So here's a perfect example. This beech tree, you can see just how many nuts are appearing on it, and this is quite low down in the canopy and it's still got huge nut production. You can also see below it just how little undergrowth there is. So in winter, it's stark. You can see a nice clearing underneath it, whereas if you compare that to just the other side of the track where it's more mixed woodland but predominantly pine, you can see just how much green moss undergrowth there is. So it's a really interesting way of clearing land without having to clear land. You haven't got to spread pesticide, you haven't got to spread herbicides. You're not trying to destroy the ecosystem. Just use beech leaves. So for the first time we're entering into a spot that's got hazel as an understory, and there's not that much of that this far north, so it's really interesting to see. So we've got hazel as an understory, we've got alder as an overstory, and both of those coppice and pollard very readily. So we've actually duplicated this in one spot on the croft where we've got the shelter belt right along the northern edge, right at the top of the croft. So there we've got a row of alder with a row of hazel either side. So at the point that the alder get big enough, because they will within maybe 5-10 years get big enough that they'll cast significant shade into the system in winter. So we'll be able to coppice them at the bottom. Then the hazel will really fly up. They'll do really well, released into the sunshine until the alder coppice, regenerate and overtake from them again, at which point we can take the hazel as a crop and then they'll regenerate And at the point that they're coming up to, okay, they make a good crop again at this point and they're up high enough to give us good shelter belt, we can take the alder again. So the whole thing is going through on succession. It'll last for centuries. The alder will also be releasing a huge amount of nitrogen below the ground because of its nitrogen fixing ability with the hazel, so they'll grow very aggressively as well, as will the current crop below that, maybe some berries and so on. There's a lot of places that we've seen this replicated in this woodland. Alder and hazel, loving it, growing very well together. You can see just how green and lush these are. These have had no fertilizer whatsoever. It's in a naturally occurring woodland. They're getting a lot of fertilizer both through the general biomass of the system, but specifically from its association with the alder. This side we've got a sycamore. This is actually been coppiced already. You can see the stool where it's regenerated from at the bottom. An interesting system for polewood. I wouldn't plant sycamore intentionally. We've got a little bit that we manage for coppice, just literally a couple of trees, but I wouldn't plant this intentionally. But if I was gonna plant a member of this family, because it does seem quite happy here, it's doing very well. It's planted right tight up against birch, and there's oak there as well, and they all seem very happy. There's nothing that's having a detrimental effect on anything else. So I'd be tempted to try, well, why don't we go with a sugar maple or something else in that family, which is probably the best example, that will give us a usable yield, because a sugar source this far north is very rare. So a sugar maple would do well. Which is why it's been used extensively, in the far north, in North America. So that again is just suggestive of what species in these families can we put in that'll be higher yielding than what we've got here, but still behaving much the same way, with everyone getting along really happily. So it's something we have, other than the sycamore, it's something we have pretty much replicated on the croft. So a slight variation again, we've got an overstory of alder, again doing its nitrogen fixing trick. But this is interesting because this isn't something that you'd normally associate with a naturally occurring woodland. This is a purple beech, of course, but it doesn't look fully purple. So I suspect this is hybridized, some pollen's been brought in and has produced a nut that's a hybrid of the native and a purple. It's a very beautiful tree. I like it. In fact, I almost prefer it to the deep purple one. So if you are someone that wants to have a really decorative, formal garden with, beautiful trees, you've still got the option. You've still got the same benefit of having, a fully productive coppice tree that also looks beautiful. It's something that I'm still on the fence about the purple, to be honest. I'm probably going to go with some purple hazel, but I don't know. Is there any difference in purple hazel and purple beech in terms of, I'd probably go for purple, I think. But there's also some more hazel there. Most of the hazels in this section aren't particularly productive at the moment. They're not having a particularly productive year. There's some further on that are quite heavy with nuts. But I think they've probably got a bit more access to the canopy. It's quite dark in here, so the hazels that are existing as an understory, they're not getting a huge amount of sun. So they're not getting, really good nut production, which isn't a problem. If you're growing them in conjunction with other trees in a coppice system, because you're always creating clearings within it, so different nuts have got different access to it, to the light in different years. And of course, below the whole thing, we've got nettle, which everyone knows nettle. It's the one plant you can pick in the dark, but but it, massively useful. It's really interesting. It's massively important from an ecological perspective. There's a lot of things that live on nettle. It's a really interesting leaf, but also, of course, it's a good protein-rich leaf that can be used as a spinach substitute and so on. We tend to have it around just because it's a good thing for chopping, in large volume, because it's such a biomass generator. You can cut it in large volume. We can rot it down in water and create feed with it. It's a really useful plant. You wouldn't necessarily want it growing through, your zone 1 annual garden just outside your back door, but if you've got a quiet corner somewhere, absolutely you want nettle. It thrives with just about everything. The more nitrogen you give it, the happier it is. There's also some dead nettle at the back there as well. I think that has an edible seed. None of these things are stuff that you'd use in large volume, but interesting nevertheless. But this is what interested me the most, is the fact that we got this nice semi-purple beech right in deep woodland. In fact, that's a normal green beech above it, and I think just popping through there's the beginnings, the very top of an ash tree as well. I can't even see where the base of the ash tree is, but it's reached the canopy. So it's a really mixed, diverse woodland. It's interesting. But yeah, you can have beautiful species within it if you want. A bit more decorative, like the purple. Nature doesn't care, it'll adapt. And this is the thing, the purple beech already exists within the landscape. It's become naturalized. There's no point being too worried about it at this point. Whether it's as productive in terms of beech mass, who knows? So I probably wouldn't rely overly on it, but yeah, you can also have beautiful trees as well. So this is an example of a nice, really nice, mature hazel stool. You can see this is still the main trunk coming up here, but at some point it's been browsed or it's been grazed, and you can see all the side shoots that are coming out. And there's a whole stand of them coming through here. This is a particularly nice one. You can see how nice some of this polewood is. I mean, that's, you know, construction quality polewood. Hazel doesn't make the best building materials, but, you know, it lasts reasonably well. You can see some of the shoots coming off. So for things like, you know, bean poles and pea poles and stuff, it's as good as it gets, hazel. And this isn't particularly old. First off, you can see we're not very far in. You can see the light behind me, just how far into the wood we are. But more specifically, at the base of this, I can still see the remains of the plastic guards that were put on it to protect it from the deer. Only now, of course, instead of it being that high, it's this high because it's been expanded outwards. On some of the smaller ones, you can see, like this one here, oops, you can see the plastics down the bottom here. It shows the importance of taking the plastics off before they get too big. Once they're above deer brows, that should be taken out. But you can see just how productive this is. This is not a very old stand of hazel. This has been intentionally planted within the last couple of decades. And yet you can see here we have a really big, you know, solid, productive part of the landscape. So, really low battery, but quick. We've got an older overstory. We've got another holly. Again, doing really well. Everything's happy with it. And we've got hazel, an old hazel coppice. And there's a whole row of hazel coppice coming through here. We've also got a bit of ash starting to come through as natural regeneration. Everything cooperating, everything doing well. So you can see here we've got a really healthy raspberry patch. We've got bramble, nice blackberry, going straight up. You can imagine that being trained through the lower limbs of a tree very successfully. Both looking really happy. We have alder as an overstory and willow as a story way above that as well. But right down at ground level, we've got strawberry. Now, whether that's wild strawberry or a garden escape, probably wild strawberry from the look of the size of it, the leaves, but yeah, all doing really nicely together. So you can see these ones down here are actually having a decent hazel year. I mean, you can see there's quite a few nuts on this particular hazel tree, and this is low in the canopy. It's out in the center of the path, but there's trees both sides. It's not getting a huge amount of direct sun for a large portion of the day, and yet you can see we're getting a good, reliable crop of nuts coming. We might have to come back in about a month or so and see if we can get some, just because these are really good locally adapted varieties, so we can get them to use as seed stock, not even for eat, to grow more nuts. Really, really cool. So just for the last few minutes, we started seeing the odd blackthorn starting to creep in, and then we came across the parent bush. You can see just how much fruit there is on this. It's still green, it hasn't turned purple yet, but it's a very, very productive cultivar. I'd be very tempted, if I was going to grow from seed, to come and get seed from this one. I mean, up in here you can see it's just festooned with fruit. There's masses of it. And sloes, of course, not the best eating fruit, but massive. You know, the biggest use really is for use sloe gin for the Arga-loving, barber-wearing crowd. You know, if they haven't got sloes locally, apparently a certain type of middle-class English person, they come to blows over picking sloes. So you can totally sell this stuff on the internet and make a profit. So it's not something that you eat, but it is something that is aspirational for a certain type of person, and they're prepared to pay good money for it. If you're taking birch as a crop of any description, one of the more interesting things about birch is that it comes with its own firelighter. So every time that you split or harvest a birch log out of your wood pile, leave the bark on it, because you bring it in, you peel the bark off, and that's your firelighter. It's an amazing tree, very, very good. It's loaded with oils, it burns very readily, even when it's been raining for days. But in terms of, you know, keeping the home fires burning, it's very, very cool, because it's got this really instant light effect. You can just literally peel off a big slab of bark, tear it into sections, away you go. You can get a fire lit much more quickly with birch than you can most things. So getting back towards the car park again, we're under a pine overstory again. And this is quite interesting. We've got beech coming through as an understory. There's quite a few of them. Yeah, they're quite low. They've probably been grazed quite heavily, but they're here. We also, of course, have the heather and we have birch. Birch is very dominant as an understory in this forest. But also this end, we're starting to come through with more of this type of moss, but also bilberry. Now, bilberry, of course, is a far north European version, close cousin of blueberry. I really like bilberry. I got really positive associations from making pancakes, camping, and so on. If I had a pine stand anywhere on my land, I would be introducing bilberry. But you can see how everything is working perfectly well. There's no fruit on this as yet. It's still quite small. Oh, hang on, no, it's not a lie. There's a bilberry. Cool. They're an okay fruit, but once they're cooked, oh, sweet, beautiful, rich. Really enjoy them. But yeah, that's an interesting one. Oh, there's more back here. I might have to pick some. But even with quite a bit, so we've got a pine overstory, we've got a birch understory below that. Below that, we've got basically shrubs acting as a shrub layer. Well, sorry, young trees acting as a shrub layer. We've still got a lot of stuff going on even down here. You could still get a fruit yield even with 3-4 trees over. It's quite surprising sometimes. So that's pretty much it really. It was more of the same, more variations on the same theme. It's surprising how many layers you can get into a food forest even this far north. So it'll be interesting to see over the next 10, 20, 30 years, assuming I'm still around then, how our systems evolve and how productive they can be, and how much maintenance they need. It's going to be interesting. The more I walk around a place like that, I start realizing, it should behave a lot like a natural ecosystem. I mean, it's basically the same, just more productive varieties of what's growing naturally here. So I think we're going to stop and have a bit to eat. It's actually coming out of rain. But before we do, we're going to harvest some seed. This is broom. Massively productive biomass generator, relatively short-lived, doesn't like the shade. So if I was starting again from scratch, one of the first things I do is plant several thousand broom, plant them out en masse, and when they get up to this kind of height, then I start planting trees in. But you live and learn. Should have come here first, should have learned what this place had to show me.